Hello everyone, my name is Cohen Brawley and I'm a freelance 3D artist working in the AAA games industry. Over the years I've worked on many AAA titles and I've gained vast knowledge when it comes to 3D asset creation for weapons, vehicles, and props, whether that be for games or film. I have found that it can be fairly easy to find various 3D tutorials out there for our hobbyists. However, I wanted to start a tutorial series focused on AAA quality art creation for 3D artists looking to strengthen their skills, whether they are already in the industry or hoping to break into the AAA industry. So in this tutorial I will share some of this AAA industry knowledge with you. Before we get started, it will be assumed that you already have a basic understanding of 3D art and the programs that I will be using. It is also encouraged that you pause the video whenever the pace might be getting a bit too quick for your speed. Also, feel free to ask any questions in the comment section of this video as well, and I will try my best to answer them when I can. So without further ado, let's get started. As mentioned in the title of this video, I will be texturing a gas canister prop. So I'll go ahead and get this mesh loaded into Substance Painter. And once that loads, I do want to swap my camera settings from perspective to orthographic. I prefer orthographic, it just allows me to get an overall view of the model as I'm texturing. And under shader settings, I want to swap the specular quality from low to high. It'll just give a better representation of the textures. And swap the panorama to Studio Tomoko. The default panorama just gives off a very yellowish tint to the entire scene, which makes it very difficult to get some neutral understanding as to what the textures will look like in a neutral lighting scenario. Also, I'll be using my own licensed textures for this video. They are primarily Rust textures, but if you're looking for Rust textures as well, I would say textures.com is a really good place to get various textures, as well as Quixel. Quixel's website's really good, and there's a few other really good ones out there. Just keep in mind though, when you're using licensed content, especially for commercial work, you gotta make sure you understand what the license is allowing you to use the content for. I see a lot of 3D artists work in the commercial industry. They tend to get anything and everything off the internet, which certainly can be a legal issue or a legal headache for the studio if they later realize the content you're using you had zero ownership of. So just double check and make sure that you're using licensed content that you're allowed to use. A lot of studios too, you can always run it by them, their legal team, to make sure it's something you can use. And if you can't, no big deal. It just means you will probably have to go out and capture your own textures, which is why for my own commercial work, I tend to have a library of my own content that I've made throughout the years. As you can see here, I'm using a paint layer to project some Rust decals onto the asset. You might be wondering why I'm not using just like a black and white alpha with the shapes of the Rust map onto it. And the reason for that is you'll certainly get the really nice shapes of the Rust through that method, same way I'm doing here, but you won't necessarily get the color information from it. And the color variation on these Rust textures are just too nice to pass up. So that's why I'm just projecting it using the paint layer method. It just helps me ensure that I'm maintaining both the shapes and the color information. And you also might be wondering why I'm adding the Rust so early on. The reason being is I don't want to get too focused on the base color of the asset, just to find out later on when I'm adding the Rust that the color is not singing with the Rust texture too well. So that's why I'm just doing the Rust texture first. And as you can see here, I'm trying to make sure the base color is going to sing in correlation with the Rust texture flawlessly. And as you can see here, they're not. There's quite a bit of odd looking issues. I'm basically using a masking method right here to try to mask out the little white stroke effect that's around this Rust texture, and to get rid of that, because that white stroke is really giving away that this is a decal projection. So I'm going to be spending quite a bit of time here trying to clean that up. I'm also going to darken the color of the rust. And also, as you saw, I was adjusting the roughness of the rust. And still just really trying to get rid of that odd pixelated effect around the edges. And here I'm just going to cycle through different blending modes. Sometimes the blending modes will really help blend the overlaying detail, or yeah, the overlaying colors with the underlaying colors. I really like this dark color, but as you'll notice, it really completely got rid of the color variation that I was originally wanting to preserve for this detail. So using an anchor point, I can later receive that color above this layer to try to draw it back in. But right now I'm using a sharpen to sharpen those textures back up a bit. Originally they're looking a bit low resolution. But as you can see here, I'm adding another fill layer on top of this rust. And this fill layer will be responsible for bringing our color back. But as you can see, the white pixels around this detail are really just destroying the look of this graphic. So I'll use a blur and the levels to try to clamp out those white looking edges. Now you can see we're starting to get that color variation in the center of our rust back, which is awesome. And I'll also disable that roughness channel. As we originally already messed with that roughness channel, and this layer was removing that. All we want it to be responsible for is the color variation. And I'm just going to create another filler called Rust Pilling, and we'll add a black mask to it. Inside this mask, add a fill layer receiving the anchor point information of our rust. And I want to use this layer to create an alpha that will create the peeling gradient of the rust. So what we first need to do is try to collect the rust information and clamp it in a way that outlines where the rust is located. And I'll also use this other anchor point from our rust color to subtract the rust in the center. And as you can see here, I got most of the rust masked out into the position that I'm wanting it to be. I will then use a blur slope filter to create some areas that are blurred and some areas that are not so blurred. And this will certainly be the variation we need to achieve this paint chip effect. So I'll also set another fill layer to subtract above this one from our rust color. And now you can see we have little chips around the edges. However, they're a bit too sharp, so I want to blur them out a bit with a blur filter. And with this blur filter, I'll just set it to a value of around 0.27, maybe a bit more. And you can see we got some nice peeling happening. I'll use the levels to adjust the intensity of it. And I want to set the scene to 4K for right now. Yeah, we'll most definitely lower it if this goes into a game. It's just right now I need it set to 4K to get a better understanding as to what's happening with these paint chips. I'll also tweak the color channel a bit on these paint chips to give them a bit of desaturation. A lot of times when paint gets this aged and worn, it'll start to lose its color. So I certainly want to make sure that detail is applied here for this asset. I'll also add another paint layer and set it to pass through on its base color. And I'll add a levels to this paint layer. And I just want to use the levels to adjust the contrast and the color. It is adjusting the color in the rust texture as well, which I don't want. So I will use a black mask with a fill layer and select our rust paint. Just make sure you select the correct one, which is the rust color paint mask. And I'll set it to invert, and now it's only affecting the color outside of the rust. I'll add a filter in HSL, and I can just use this filter to tweak the brightness inside that paint layer. You can use it for many other things, such as adjusting the color and saturation as well, but for that instance I just want to adjust the contrast. I'll be creating another fill layer, and I will be using this fill layer to create dents on the metal. So you'll need to add a fill layer, apply a black mask to it, and add another fill layer inside that black mask using the creases, or one of the creases, or even the folds texture works. And I'll just blur this channel a bit. Sometimes the directional blur is actually pretty good for dents. It doesn't quite just blur everything in the mask. You can use it just to blur in specific directions, which is kind of nice. And before I get too far along, I do want to bake out some mesh maps for this asset. It's something I probably should have done in the beginning of the video, but it doesn't really hurt anything at all to bake it later on. It's just obviously once you need to start using generators that require them, that's kind of the time you need to bake them out. I'll add another filler with a black mask, and I'll just be using this layer to introduce some surface variation. I'm planning on going with more of a darker color for this variation. It'll also help with the contrast situation. And I'll use a sharpen to sharpen this grunge a bit. It was looking slightly low resolution. And if it's looking too sharp, you could either decrease the sharpen intensity, or the warp filter is pretty good at keeping it sharp while removing some of those pixels that you might start to see when something's slightly too sharp. And I caught a UV seam there, so I'll need to be painting that out to address that. It looks like it was originally coming from our rust texture, so we'll be using the erase tool to erase that out. Keep in mind too, for this video I'll only be spending an hour on this assets textures, but obviously for production or even a portfolio piece, certainly feel free to spend much more than an hour. I'm trying to keep these tutorial videos under an hour, and reason being is just I don't have all the time in the world to make 8-hour tutorials as much as I wish I could. So just keep that in mind. Some of this stuff I don't have a lot of time for cleanup, so just make sure if you're following along that you spend the time to clean up any projection errors or areas that might not be looking too sweet. But I'll be creating another fill layer. This one will also be responsible for rust, and this layer will be more for hand painted rust and more strategically placed rust rather just stenciling it. I also want to go into my grunge fill layer down here and give it some slight height information. This will just help make it appear that the paint is bubbling up a bit in some areas. I'll also add another filler with a black mask, and we'll add a dirt generator in here. And we'll be creating a pretty interesting effect. I want to create the illusion that the asset has been kind of quickly painted, not a great paint job, and that some of the paint has built up in the crevices. And whenever that happens, obviously it's layered paint, so it's going to be raised up a bit in those areas. This is a detail that can certainly be seen quite a bit on military vehicles, where they don't give it a fancy spray paint job that you might see on a modern car. It's just basically just dumped in paint, buckets of paint. Might be a great example. So I'm just trying to create that effect. It just adds more interest to this asset. I did spot this little projection error here, and I'm hiding and unhiding the layers to try to locate its origin, which it looks like it's coming from the dents. And I'll be using a UV border generator set to subtract, and this will just make sure that the projection errors will be subtracted from any areas that are near the UV border. Because a lot of that error that you were seeing was influenced by the UV seams. So that UV border generator is just going to subtract those areas. And I'm going to hand paint some rust on these edges. Again, I'm trying to keep these tutorial formats within 1 hour, so I'm not really going to go through every single edge like I would like to, but I'm just going to do a few areas to give a pretty good example of my approach. And in a case like this, it might be more efficient actually to just use grunge textures and project some grunge onto the asset. In this instance, I'll be using my rust texture here, which has some pretty good shapes in it. You'll notice it's very gray and faded out. Most people would be like, why not just fix that in Photoshop? But you could actually just use the levels to fix it, and it works perfectly fine. And here I'm just going through and painting some more details in. You gotta make sure too, whenever you're adding edgeware, that's in the areas that make sense. Also, make sure your edgeware is always doing something. You don't ever want edgeware that's just a perfectly straight on directional edgeware, or uniform edgeware is what it's called. I'm typically not a fan of just like edge chips that happen in the middle of nowhere on an asset. Kind of like what I was just now doing, but for this particular asset, I think it makes sense if the paint got some type of impact to expose it. As soon as that happens, it exposes what's under the paint to the elements of the environment. So once this rust starts happening under the paint will start peeling away, almost like a bubble, a little pocket behind the paint. As you can see here, this is a really cool macro detail. It really breaks up the original detail I had there. This detail is just it's an odd shape. It feels unnatural, so I'm trying to cover it up with another rust shape. As you can see, it almost looked like a brush stroke originally, so I'm just wanting to break that up quite a bit. I'm also going through and just trying to support these details a bit more thoroughly. I did decide to put some of this really cool rust texture inside our underlying rust texture. It'll just help unify the rust as well. I really wanted to avoid an area where it's really dark and black rust and then this new introduction of a completely different rust texture. It's fine to do a bit, it makes sense. It totally can happen with rust, where some areas are coloring different than others, or sorry, discolor different than others. But obviously when it's too contrasted of a difference, it's just very odd looking, so I wanted to clean that up a bit. I'm not a fan of what the paint chips are doing down here. It's a bit odd. It looks like some type of damage happened in that crevice, which is quite unlikely. So I'm going to try to clean that up. I'll just put all these rust layers inside this folder, and even our color correction. Set the folder to pass through because we do have some layers set to pass through in there. And I'll add a generator, a dirt generator. And I just want to use this dirt generator to subtract from the crevices. So that way my wear is no longer happening in those crevices, which originally looked very unrealistic. And I will use a blur slope, and that will help randomize, I'm sorry, a warp, and that will randomize some of the chips in there. So that way you get less of that procedural looking details that you get from stuff like generators, or sorry, dirt generators. Just decreasing and messing with some of the values to get some more variation going on. It's pretty cool too. I'm killing two birds with one stone. We have a pretty interesting color variation that happens now too in those crevices where the red is no longer so saturated once we get in those tiny crevices. Again, make sure you spend a bit more time than what I'm kind of doing here, but I'm just making that little knob at the top there completely rusted out. It's something that'll be I guess touched quite a bit with human hands, or just interacted in some ways. Certainly gonna completely rust and lose its paint job fairly quickly. I also want to get some scuffs and scratches on this prop. Paint chips are one thing, but they certainly need to be supported with scratches or scuffs wherever needed. Yeah, and here's a pretty cool trick. I'm using cylindrical projection to project these scratches around the asset, and now I basically don't have to worry about UV seams cropping up or becoming a headache. I want to make the scratches pretty matte in the gloss, and with paint like this, when it gets scuffed, I'm going to assume that's fairly chalk looking. I've seen it quite a bit with various equipment, that being farm equipment or construction equipment or military vehicles. If the paint gets scratched in some way, sometimes it's not really taking off the whole paint, it's just taking off the clear coat that's on the paint. That's pretty much the effect I'm trying to create here. The clear coat is basically the gloss on painted surfaces. And I'm using the rust texture again here for our scratches this time. So what I'm trying to accomplish here is basically some of the scratches I want to contain rust information, as if the scratch got so deep into the paint that's now starting to rust, while some scratches are just surface scratches, therefore being clear coat scratches, which tend to have that white chalk looking effect to it. So I'll just duplicate the rust wear filler, and I'll add a dirt generator to this layer. And I want to use this layer to create rust in the crevices. However, whenever you're using a generator, you always need to be mindful of the procedural looking effects that it can create. So it's very important that we do a few tricks here to try to mitigate that a bit. Right now I'm using a UV border generator that'll kind of clamp down a bit on the dirt. I also want to use a warp, and that'll add some noise to the dirt. And much of this should also be supported with actual hand painted dirt. In the end, there's only so much you can get out of a generator until it just really starts to make your asset look procedural. So I'd say 9 times out of 10, it's just best to hand paint the details in, or use stencils, photo-based stencils, rather trying to tweak a generator to get it looking good. And it's very difficult to utilize a generator in the capacity of trying to achieve photorealism. Generators always tend to leave some type of CGI filling fingerprint, which in some games, if that's the style, it looks good, but at least a lot of the titles I work on where we just really want stuff looking very photorealistic, it's really not ideal to be using it. So in here, a lot of times water and just moisture will collect in these crevices, and over time it erodes the paint and just turns it straight into rust. So I'm trying to really storytell that in here. I certainly want to make sure too that I have rust happening at the bottom of the asset. It's certainly probably going to be the area of the asset that's most exposed to elements. I guess a lot of storytelling you could put behind it maybe is sitting in a garage and the garage flooded, and so obviously a lot of that flood water, if it's ankle deep, it's certainly going to just rust the bottom of the gas can here, or sorry, gas canister. And just adding details at the bottom of the asset really help ground the asset, and just visually communicates what the top of the asset is and what the bottom is, and just really helps with environment transition. It's very similar to like a maybe a cement wall. You don't ever want to just place a cement wall in an environment and call it good. You want to make sure you have some type of transitional decal happening where the wall meets the terrain's environment and have that transition reflecting the color of that environment that might be under the cement wall. So if the cement wall is in a sandy environment, there's obviously going to be a lot of sand brushed up against that wall. So it's very similar mentality here with what I was doing at the bottom of the gas canister. And again, I was just adding some rust around the trim there. I'm looking for, in particular, like a directional rust. Maybe with this gas canister was stored in some type of maybe a case that contains these gas canisters, and therefore just really scratching up the bottom of it. So obviously I can't get the stencil to wrap around the asset in the 3D view, so I'm just going to go into the 2D view and manually project the stencil onto the asset's UVs. And I'll use the levels to really bring out the contrast of these scuffs. And I'll use the HSL to darken it, and that'll also help the scuffs show up a bit better. It's really important that your wear is always doing something differently based off of what area it is on the asset. So obviously down here it's very directional shaped, and then in the center of the gas canister it's very paint chip based, and then at the top, as you saw, it was very focused on the crevices where condensation and moisture might be collecting and creating corrosion there. As you can see here, I'm duplicating the rust effects here, and I just want this layer responsible for the height, and I'll use the blur slope filter to create some variation in the height and also soften it a bit. It was a bit too strong originally, so this will help introduce some variation, and we need to pull back on the height just a bit so that way it's not too intense. Every once in a while too, it's pretty important to back up a bit from your model and just inspect it and check for things that might be working or not working. And what I'm gonna do here is I feel like there's lots of nice rust details, but there's nothing. It needs something to just catch the eye. The eye needs something to look at. So I will be introducing like an explosive label onto this asset, or like a warning label of some sort. So that's what I'll be doing here. I have this flammable solid sticker that I will be applying onto the asset. Again, I'm just using a paint layer and entering projection mode. I'm just trying to find a good spot to paste it at. I was thinking of putting in the center of the asset there, but that area already has interesting details, so I'm just trying to put it in a specific part of the asset that's starting to get a bit boring or too busy. So this area works pretty well, however the colors are a bit off, a bit too bright, so we just need to adjust that with the levels, and that should fix it. I'll add a black mesh to it as well and grab our rust texture and invert it. And this will just ensure that the label's kind of peeled away wherever our rust is happening at. So it just helps introduce the label to our asset better. It feels pretty fake whenever there's a label on top of where and the wear under the label is not affecting the label at all, so certainly something we need to avoid here. And I will use a warp filter to kind of break it up a bit so it's not completely just generated looking, which is also another effect you can get by just using grunges like that. You just gotta make sure the label's not perfectly in line with the rust. And I'm just gonna apply an anchor point to that fill layer so we can receive it in this one. Now this layer is going to be responsible for the label's height channel. So we'll use this to add that height and some roughness. I'm just gonna tweak. It's certainly going to be requiring a bit of tweaking because the issue with this layer is that it's looking at the projection of our flammables decal, and it's looking for the dark colors in it. And the issue with those dark colors is they become removed from our mask. So because of that, we now have to manually paint those areas back in, so that way we get our height back. I have jitter enabled. It came with the brush I was using for the rust, so just gotta make sure you disable jitter. So I do want some contact dirt between the label and the gas canister. So I'll add an anchor point to this label background mask and add another fill layer with a black mask and retrieve that anchor point into this fill layer. And we'll use a blur slope along with the blur around this label's mask. And after we do that, we will add a fill layer on top of all of this, setting it to subtract. And now we're left with this results where we can add some dark diffuse information around the label, and then also adjust its roughness channel to give it a bit of a matte roughness. And I'll just make sure I name that fill layer. I'm not great at always naming every single fill layer, but definitely try to get in the habit of doing it. It'll save you lots of headaches if you need to go back and fix something or look for a layer that might be causing some odd effect. So what this fill layer will be responsible for is some dents on the rim of the canister here. So it's going to be primarily in our height channel here, and the blur slope filter will really help give us some variation there. And I'll use a blur to blur this dent, or give some softness to the dent. And now that I'm happy with what this fill layer is doing, I'm just going to go around this rim here and paint in these dents. And I'm pretty happy with how these dents are turning out. I will use a dirt generator set to subtract, and some of those areas where I kind of missed and hit the back of the canister where it wouldn't really make any logical sense that a dent would occur, this dirt generator will just make sure it removes that detail where I misclicked. And there we go. So now we only have the dirts happening on that rim there. And the cool thing about this is we can even use it for other areas of the asset to add additional dents. I'm trying to keep these dents only located where the paint chips are happening, because it would be quite odd if a dent occurred in an area where no rust was accumulating. And I'm going to duplicate our rust filler and apply our dents in it. And the cool thing about this is it will add rust in some of these dents. So it'll really help storytell that some of these areas got dented, and then not only dented but received edge chips. It is looking a bit soft, so I'll need to address that. And I'm just going to apply a blur slope to the paint chips, and that'll help ensure that the paint chips are not religiously following the dents, which would also be a bit unrealistic. And I'm going to use a cloth folds again to introduce some more additional dents. And I'll set it to spherical projection as well, just to ensure no UV seams crop up. And this is being multiplied on top of our rust, our very original rust decal. And again, this is just going to create dents that are very focused inside that area. And the blur slope will also help add some variation inside these dents. We really want to avoid these dents from looking like just default cloud gradients. Definitely want to avoid that. The blur slope will create a bit of a odd pixelated effect every once in a while, so a blur filter will will fix that. Just keep the blur filters subtle, and it should be fine. And again, just make sure the dents are not collecting in an area that doesn't make sense, such as these crevices. Some of these crevices down here are so tucked away and hidden, it'd be very unlikely that they'd receive contact damage like that. And some of these dents are just a little too strong for my taste, so I'm just pulling back on them. And I'll just name that fill layer small dents. And again, just make sure you paint out any dents and crevices that do not make sense. I did notice down here at the bottom of the canister, it's too clean looking. I'd certainly expect quite a bit of damage of some sort to happen down here. I'm just making sure I address that right now. It's always important. I feel like anything in 3D, if you notice an issue, you gotta address it immediately. Because if you kick the can down the road, the chances are you'll probably just forget about it. I'm just trying to find a rust texture that suits this area best, which this one does it well. I just needed to support it more and more, so that way it creates that effect that the more central down there it got, the more worn out it got. Putting some wear in here too, but obviously got quite a bit of stencil errors there, so I'm just trying to address that. Again, I would like to spend quite a few hours in areas like this part, just adding all kinds of details, but obviously I just want to not spend 2 days on a tutorial, so I just want to focus on the important stuff. And right here, you might ask yourself what in the world I'm doing, but I'm trying to create that a weld basically that is very commonly seen with canisters. The machine basically clamps the sheet metal 360 around, and at the ends where they meet, they weld it up to seal it. So that's literally the same effect I'm trying to create here. Substance Painter has some great weld brushes, which I would recommend giving a shot as well, but I do like the blur slope in its effect of creating a weld. It can create a pretty good looking weld. And you could probably do the same trick with this weld as we did with the label, which is adding an anchor point to it and adding another fill layer on top, and collecting that weld's location, blurring it, and then subtracting it. It'll create this dirt effect around the weld, which is pretty nice. I'll be grabbing my rust wear texture again, and I want to add this on my weld, and this will allow me to get some chips happening on the weld, so that way some areas of the weld look like it's been chipped. And again, I'm just circling around the asset, inspecting it. A lot of the times too, when I'm doing this, I'm just trying to think what other details could it use, what details are hurting it, etc. So it's always really important to step back from your model every once in a while and just kind of examine and think what could benefit and what's hurting it. A really important thing to keep in mind as well is players are not going to be up close to this model as you might be as you're texturing it. That's why it's really important to back up a bit and try to see it in the player's eyes when the player is 10 feet away from this asset, how it looks. Because you might get yourself focused on so many small details that in the end they're so small once the player's 10 feet away in game. All of those details you added are not really noticeable at all, and you run the risk of it just being I guess for example here, a solid red canister from a distance with no other details, because you focus too much on very minute minute details such as dust specks and such. So always be cautious of that. As you can see here, I'm adding a fill layer with a black mask, and I'm stenciling some text here. It's just some random text. I wanted to give it the fact that somebody put text here and spray painted on top of it, and then remove these stencils or whatever it would be, maybe stickers of the letters on the text, just to create a very interesting visual look. But yeah, I do quite a bit of, I'm noticing doing quite a bit of like off-topic commentary for these videos, and reason I'm doing that is I don't think people are really going to be entertained with me saying add a fill layer here, add a black mask, add levels. It's always nice to mix it up with side note commentary. But certainly let me know in the comments if you prefer the video to be just strictly talking about every single layer and paint layer, or if you're okay with the offhand commentary. As you can see here, this detail's looking pretty sweet. I've mainly just been using the warp filter and occasional blur slope to get some variation going on in this text. I decided to go with a different font with that text there. The original font looked good, it just wasn't quite what I was looking for, so I swapped it out. So I'm just gonna copy this rust wear folder, or sorry, filler, and paste it at the top. I have some plans with it to add some more additional details, and again I'm just going to make sure I try to name these layers as much as I can. And I want to use this grunge to get some additional paint chips in areas I may have overlooked. And these are not going to be the most photorealistic looking chips you've ever seen, but it's going to be in areas that are not well exposed, or sorry, well seen. So it's going to serve its purpose, or serve for what we're needing it for. So I'm just going to again make sure I name this folder here, add a black mask to it. I'll use a dirt generator, and the dirt generator will basically place the where we need it. And again, just want to make sure you use a blur slope with this dirt generator, because it could just cause some problems if I just let the generator do what it wants to do on its own. It'll create some just odd fall off areas in the mask. I want to add another fill layer with a black mask, and inside the black mask of the fill layer I want to add a grunge, and I want this grunge to create the illusion that the sun itself has started to age the paint. A lot of props that are outdoors tend to lose the saturation in their paint due to the sun. Which is a pretty cool storytelling effect, which is what I want to create here. And I'll use a light generator in Substance Painter. It pretty much it's pretty much self-explanatory. It's a light, but it adds the information wherever you tell it to position to, and then now you can set it to multiply. And as you can see, I have this very dust looking effect. There is a dedicated dust generator for Substance Painter. I believe it's somewhere on the internet, but it does not come with vanilla Substance Painter. And as you can see here, I want to collect the color information of the asset using a paint layer set to pass through and an anchor point, and I can collect that information and now dictate where I want this surface detail to happen at. So I don't really want the fading of the paint happening anywhere where the rust is at. I was hoping the color information collector paint layer was going to give me the information I needed, but in the end I did need to go back and add an anchor point to the rust fill layer and set it to subtract inside this mask, and that eventually fixed it. But yeah, for some weird reason the color information collector wasn't really getting me the input from the mask that I was needing. And as you can see there, I'm just adding an anchor point to that rust crevices and grabbing that information and setting it to subtract, and it will just subtract it from that sun damage. But yeah, the sun damage is a really cool detail. Just try to be wise as to what asset you're applying it to. Primarily I do a lot of weapons, and this isn't really a detail I do to a firearm because firearms are not really left outside in the sun, so it just would be very silly to see such damage happening to a firearm. I'd only expect details like this to happen to outdoor props. So the paint could still use some variation apart from the rust. which is what I'm trying to achieve here. Yeah, and I want this detail to affect the paint in some way, give it some type of color variation, because I was still seeing a bit of that cherry red paint underneath, which was basically the very first fill layer we created in this painter scene. So this layer will just help introduce even more variation to that. But there certainly needs to be a cutoff limit as to how much variation you're using in your textures. You can certainly overload your textures by adding too much variation and detail, so really be mindful of that. So as you can see, it is applying it to the rust surfaces as well. So instead of having to go through all the trouble of collecting the anchor points from my rust fill layers, I will just add this fill layer down with our base fill layer. And as you can see, it works just fine. My original plan for this fill layer was just color variation, but as you can see, I did add some height information, which is fine. There's nothing wrong with having a fill layer that does two different jobs. So in the end, it did add some nice color variation and some nice small bubbles to the paint there. And that's it for this asset. We are pretty much finished. If you're following along, I would say just make sure you spend the time to try out your own details. You don't necessarily have to do the exact thing I'm doing, but if you want to follow me one-to-one, that's completely fine. Just keep in mind I did have to keep all this in a 1-hour video, so I didn't have a lot of time for refinement or polishing any of these textures, but overall the result came out really nice. I'm pretty happy with it. Just obviously, if you're doing this for a portfolio piece or a commercial project, you do want to give yourself at least another hour or two to polish and make refinements where needed. But yeah, thanks for watching, and I hope you found this tutorial informative. If you'd like to see more tutorials like these in the future, certainly let me know in the comments, and follow me to stay up to date for more videos. Cheers.